Alright, hello guys. We're going to go ahead and finish up part one of our nervous system notes. These are going to be looking at the functional properties of neurons, which some of this might sound familiar from your muscle project, because remember we kind of talked a little bit about your nervous system within that muscle project itself. Okay? Alright, so when we're looking at neurons, they have some of these properties or these principles to them that basically define what they do. So neurons have the property of irritability, which does not mean that they're just kind of cranky. It means that they have the ability to respond to stimuli. They also have the property of conductivity, which means that they are able to transmit an impulse, which makes sense because that is their job in life, right? Is to pass messages from one cell to the next until it gets to where it needs to go. Now, as we kind of go through these next couple of slides, one thing to note as a foundational piece of information is that plasma membrane, the cell membrane of our neurons. Even though they're kind of strange shaped cells, that cell membrane, when it's in a relaxed state, meaning when it's not actively passing on a message, it's in a polarized state at that time. Okay, so when it's at rest, it is polarized, which means the term polarized means that there is fewer positive ions on the inside of the cell compared to the outside. So if you look at that picture down below, you note that there's a whole lot of positive ions of sodium and potassium on the outside, and only a few positive ions on the inside of that cell, which is that orange cylinder down below. Okay, so that's what your neurons are doing when they're at ease, when they're at rest, when they're not actually working. Now, when a neuron needs to send a message, then that neuron's going to go through depolarization, which some of you put into your sliding filament theory. That depolarization is a stimulus that is where we have a stimulus that depolarizes the neuron membrane. And what that means, okay, this might sound familiar as well, a depolarized membrane is going to allow for that sodium ion, all those positive ions that are floating around the outside of the cell, to flow into the membrane. A lot of times in your sliding filament theory, we talked about how the sodium ions would flood in, which would cause an action potential to go down the T tubules to release the calcium from the SR. So we've actually talked about this before. Now, whenever all of those sodium ions are rushing in, remember it causes a change in the electricity of that cell, and that's actually what helps to send that action potential onto the next neuron. It's also what helps to cause our muscles to contract too. Now that action potential, or sometimes we commonly call it the nerve impulse when we're just talking about from one neuron to another, if that action potential starts, it's going to be spread over the entire axon. And as the sodium ions rush in, the potassium ions are going to rush out. So what we see is that the sodium-potassium pump that we talked about way back in chapter 2, we talked about in biology class, that sodium-potassium pump is going to help move the sodium ions in, pushing some of the potassium ions out. And when that happens, it's actually part of the reaction that helps to relax or repolarize the cell, okay, after that message has gone through. Now, once that message has gone through, the sodium-potassium pump is going to restore the original configuration, and this is a form of active transport, so it does require energy in the form of ATP. Now, as that message is traveling through our neuron, it goes from the axon towards the cell body, and we notice that, sorry, I had a brain thought here. So we notice that impulses are going to travel faster when fibers have a myelin sheath around them. Okay, and if you remember, your oligodendrocytes and your Schwann cells are going to be responsible for making the myelin sheath in the central/peripheral nervous system. And then what happens is once it gets to the end of one neuron, it's going to then pass through the synapse or cross over the synapse to another neuron or another nerve. And it does that by taking that electrical message and then passing on that message through a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters, we talked about acetylcholine being a neurotransmitter in the muscle chapter. The neurotransmitter is released from the nerve's axon terminal. And when the neurotransmitter is released from the axon terminal, a nearby dendrite from another neuron is going to have receptors for that neurotransmitter that are going to basically collect a neurotransmitter, which is how they pass that message from one neuron to another to another. Now, as that next neuron grabs a hold of the neurotransmitter, the action potential is then going to be started in the dendrite, okay, and then collected to the cell body and passed down the axon. And so what we see in this kind of complicated picture, okay, we've got two neurons right here, okay. So if we've got a message traveling down the axon, okay, it's going to reach the end of the axon terminal, which is what this zoomed in picture looks like. That axon terminal is going to release neurotransmitters, which are going to be traveling in the vesicles, which are these little green dots that you see. And then it releases those neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters pass through the synaptic cleft and attach to receptor sites on the next set of dendrites. Okay, so what we see here is that these purple molecules right here are actually acting as the receptors for those different neurotransmitters. When those receptors get the neurotransmitter, a lot of times they will open up, allowing for the sodium that's naturally in the human body to flood inward, passing that message again from dendrite to cell body, down axon to axon terminal, to the next one, and to the next one, until it gets to its final spot. Alright, and that's going to bring us to the end of part 1. So the part 1, notice it's a lot of the microscopic stuff, a lot of the neuron stuff. The second part of this nervous system, we're going to be dealing with brain. So we'll pick that up probably next week. Hope you guys are having a good day.